When we think of taverns in fantasy, our first thought probably goes to something a bit like the Prancing Pony, which is in fact modelled on an 18th century English coaching inn. Indeed, much of the Shire and its immediate surroundings harken from a period of history not commonly associated with the kind of medievalised fantasy that we see today, with pocket watches, mantelpieces, and brass buttons on clothes. This, of course, doesn't stop us from putting fantasy-style taverns in our worlds, melting pots of travellers and strangers, where people who don't know each other can share a meal and a drink before going to bed in their rooms. The strange reality is that by definition, if it has rooms for guests, it's unlikely to be a tavern at all. So let's talk about the tavern in fantasy media, and how this strange anachronism might actually make an awful lot of sense. So to set the record straight, there are probably 3 types of building that we are talking about when we think of our fantasy tavern. At least 3 types of building in medieval Europe. One is the alehouse. This is somebody's house with a public area set aside for locals to come and drink the brewmaster's latest brew. The brewer would usually be the woman of the house, historically, and she would put out a sign or symbol so that all the locals knew that a new brew was ready, and that they should come and drink it. Being her family home, locals almost never stayed over, and even travellers who arrived for the beer were expected to find alternative accommodations. Like the alehouse, the tavern was also an alcohol-selling business. This one opened on a more permanent basis, not just whenever a brew of ale was ready. Taverns generally catered to higher-end patrons than those locals who would visit Mrs. Bennet's alehouse in her vegetable garden, and also had access to more permanent supplies. They likely sold ales made by local brewers, but specialised in alcohols that had a slightly longer shelf life, like wines or meads. Taverns also weren't usually the place to get food, either. They were more focused on wine selling, either on the individual scale per cup, or on kind of medium business scales. It's worth noting that wine here means any alcoholic beverage produced through a fruit, so cider also counts here too. As the last of these 3 types of buildings, we have the inn. This is what we usually mean in fantasy when we think of a tavern. It sells alcohol, much like the others, but has a slightly smaller selection generally than a tavern, and offers rooms to travellers. Well, not rooms per se. An inn will set aside a bed, or oftentimes realistically part of a bed, for weary travellers wanting a rest. You wouldn't get your own room, that was reserved for the nobility and the real poshos. Large beds were common, and sleeping communally with many of these large beds in the same room was also fairly common. This gives us the wonderful Shakespearean phrase, "Misery acquaints a man with strange bedfellows." In any case, inns were specifically for travellers with stuff. You'd be able to stable horses, store goods, and get a good night's sleep before the morning, when you would either move out of the inn again and continue on your way, or conduct business from the inn for a short time. Many inns did serve food, but it was generally only after the main gates had been closed and locked for curfew that they actually served the food to those patrons who were staying overnight. Inns were often in one of 2 places, either within the city walls or out in the wilderness. Those in the city walls were useful for travellers, as they could enter into a city and immediately check in their weapons and armaments at the inn, and have it serve as a base of storage and operations for their entire stay within the city. If they weren't in a settlement or were in a very small village, an inn would instead be at a point somewhere in between 2 larger settlements, probably about a full day's walk from the last place to stay. These sorts of inns would usually only host travellers for a night at a time, offering a welcome reprieve from the darkness, the wild beasts, and the wilderness. Inns of this type are really well detailed specifically in the Hoard of the Dragon Queen adventure for D&D. Inns were a relative luxury, though. Oftentimes, pilgrims and other foot-based travellers wouldn't spring for an inn on every step of their journey, so they would need other places to stay. It was actually common, for much of history, to stay with strangers of similar social class to yourself, staying just in their homes for a night or two. If this wasn't feasible, poorer folks could head towards the local monastery or even the local hospital. Hospitals at this point in history were charitable organisations which offered beds to everyone, which just so happened to morph into the most sick and deprived ending up there as much as possible, and so developing into the modern system of hospitals that we know today. Of course, the wealthiest folks among society might also avoid inns as well for very different reasons, as they can instead impose upon local lords, knights, and nobles to put them up for a few nights and give them a grand feast, probably for free, especially if they had some seniority over them. Whatever the case, it was most common for a person not to actually stay at a dedicated business while travelling, but to stay in the home of someone who was of similar social class, or had a social network, or had some sort of connection to them. This, of course, is unless the services of an inn are specifically useful to that person's journey, offering stabling for horses, offering storage for significant amounts of goods, and, of course, a social place to catch up on the news and gossip from all areas of a land. If you have no connections and know nobody in your destination of travel, an inn, therefore, as long as you've got the money to pay for it, is probably your best bet. So what does all this mean for our classic fantasy tavern, which should, in fact, technically be called an inn? Well, a few things. So far, we've been discussing real-world, medieval European history. Fantasy worlds generally have a few differences, most notably magic, monsters, and people who use magic to hurt monsters. It's this last group, the adventurer, that might actually promote the biggest change in our world-building thinking when it comes to these places of rest. We can envision the adventuring class as something of a hybrid of merchants and mercenaries. They travel from place to place in the short term, seeking out profits and opportunities, but they're also armed to the teeth and not unused to camping out, roughing it in the wilderness. Unlike a mercenary encampment, though, an adventuring camp is not a semi-military affair. They're not quite as tied to the whims and movements of military forces, and are much more freeform in their exploration and travels through the wilds. And unlike merchants, they don't tend to travel with lots of pack animals and goods for sale in other places, also travelling with many of their peers in grand caravans. It's not really an adventurous style. Indeed, an adventuring band is probably closer to a state-sponsored group of bandits, brigands, or privateers than anything else. And I do mention the state purposefully. Adventurers, or at least people who are willing to risk life and limb out in the wilderness against monsters for grand rewards, are a really, really important resource for any person in local politics, assuming you can steer them in the right direction. All at once, they remove violent elements from the city by leaving the city's walls themselves. They either served to defeat, destroy, or feed threats to travel and commerce out on the roads. And if they end up successful, their wealth gets reinvested back into the place when they come back to buy new gear after their old gear gets broken, and maybe even purchase property in the city or town. Of course, there are also the risks of them dying before any terms of their loans are finished, and losing all of their money, unable to be collected because it's out in the hoard of some dragon out in the wilds. And of course, if they die out in the wilds, the monsters or whatever's out there probably ends up carrying some of their precious loot and magic. Although that is kind of a wonderful pretense to send the next group of adventurers out with no promise of reward, just knowing there's definitely some treasure in the hands of those goblins. Don't ask me how I know. And if, in the best case scenario, an adventuring group survives again and again and again, becoming probably obscenely wealthy as a result, then, wow, would you look at that? Your city has a group of properly invested protectors who have significant social and military capital all on their own, who have a vested interest in protecting the city that they grew up in or that helped them in the adventuring life. The point really is that if you're a local landlord, then keeping the local stock of mad, reckless, idiotic adventurers on your side is about the best thing you can do. It practically, in some cases, amounts to having your own secret paramilitary force at your disposal. This is all to say that despite the fact that the poorest among these reckless monster-hunting folks might be crashing in a hospital every night or in the house of the person who's currently employing them, for those people who are under the adventuring umbrella and who are doing fairly well for themselves, it really does stand to reason that a local lord or noble may heavily subsidize a specific inn for those types of travelers' needs. Perhaps the employed innkeep is one of the Lord's own men, observing and sizing up these violent renegades in order to gently steer them towards the jobs that the Lord needs getting done. This may even be something of an open secret, so that merchants, traders, and petitioners who really need some help can go to this local inn for adventurers and brave the steep, or perhaps the incredibly subsidized prices, you could go either way, to get in touch with those who might be able to solve their problems with steel and magic for a reasonable price. In larger cities, these inns may be multiple, may be sponsored by various different nobles, maybe by a merchant's guild or a formalized adventuring guild, or even a religious organization. Perhaps a clerical league against the undead has formed, and they have banded together to purchase property and subsidize adventurers' drinks in the hopes of getting them on side too. Maybe such taverns even take the hit by allowing itinerant, vagrant adventurers to actually take out tabs, which would be silly considering their profession, choosing to eat the cost if such adventurers never come back from their quests, or for the benefit, really, of having a paramilitary of rough and ready sellswords at their disposal for their specific needs. Of course, a lot of this assumes a more D&D styled world, with heroes and villains, magic and malice aplenty. In other lower fantasy worlds, it may simply be the case that for a group of adventurers armed to the teeth, camping just outside the city walls makes a lot more sense, seeing as they're essentially one step up from armed bandits. Few cities, historically and in fantasy, would allow the carrying of large weapons in the city limits, and fewer would tolerate the presence and decide to put up violent individuals who make their living going around stabbing things, whether they're monsters or technically people. It's hard to say with goblins. Such adventurers would likely need a patron to put them up, friends to put them up, or to live in their local area. Otherwise, there's very few people who would be willing to put up with that sort of person. Of course, some of the rougher inns may willingly choose that, but then they'd be getting in constant scuffles with the actual criminals, who would also be using them. This all assumes they want a bed inside, but if they do, there are also the options of joining a local faith movement or indeed heading to the local hospital. To be fair, a low fantasy adventuring party reporting back to the hospital after every harrowing and unpleasant battle which nearly takes their lives to come and rest with the sick, the weary and the disadvantaged in society could be a really awesome setup for the kind of gritty, grounded, muddy game or story that sort of premise lends itself right to. It is worth discussing the business of inns outside city walls more specifically, though. Traditionally, in fantasy, and I don't know what this really says about our comfortability in urban environments, but the further you are from a major population centre, the deeper into the dark, dangerous wilderness and closer to the beasts and monsters of the night you tend to be. Inns at crossroads, or, just 20 miles out from the nearest major settlement, would be quite the challenge to keep open, especially considering the rather large swath of fantasy monsters that would really like to get their hands on alcohol, shelter, money, and victims. In this case, the classic fantasy trope of the veteran innkeeper might actually be of significant use to us in our world building. Roman predecessors to the inn might make an excellent starting point as well. The Roman villa model was repurposed for medieval inns throughout Europe. It had a central courtyard with rooms branching off it and a larger building attached, with a single entryway into the whole complex being through this central courtyard through gates which were lockable and securable. These would generally be closed during the night or when the inn had no further capacity for people, keeping travellers and their stuff relatively safe. This might also be the origin of the lock-in, as much of the staff wouldn't be heading home for the night either, as they likely live in the premises themselves, and so were capable of serving alcohol at least to those who were staying the night, all the way through the evening. So a large complex of rooms off of a central courtyard with a single lockable fortifiable gate filled with sellswords, veterans, merchants, adventurers, and all of their stuff and animals, with replete storerooms for surviving the night or many nights to come. Yeah, this is a fort, really. These sorts of inns could even be styled as such, rather than the kind of traditional wooden beams, wattle and daub style that we expect from our taverns. Inns. It is possible that this is replaced by some landowners just inviting adventurers directly into their personal keeps and castles, but a collection of delineated specific inns with some fortification anyway, along a major road has a few advantages. One, having stables, fresh horses, and all of this within riding distance of about a day is a really effective military resource. And two, provides a way to protect travellers at night from all of the horrible, horrible stuff that exists out there in a fantasy world. Even in a regular world, you don't want to be camping in the night when there's wolves about. It's possible that the inn in any small village is actually its most defensive point, not necessarily a great tower or some sort of keep, but the fortified structure of the inn itself. And it's possible that for military veterans, a fortified inn might end up as some sort of appointment of land by the king or by a local lord, almost kind of like a knighthood. Of course, it's also possible that we stick to the more traditional models as well, with knights being rewarded with forts, castles, and keeps. But I would say that probably as a condition of that appointment, the knight would have to open his doors to some extent to certain types of traveller. This might indeed be part of the royal decree that he must host travellers to protect them from the dangers of the night, while of course doing significant, careful checks to make sure none of them are shape changers, werewolves, vampires, or anything else that can sneak into and destroy an entire castle. Perhaps both pilgrims and adventurers alike must retain a charter from a specific religious order or a particular noble, which grants them the privilege to stay in these nightly inns, or something of that degree, so that the knight knows that he cannot turn them away and knows that they are to be trusted, theoretically, simply because travel is just so dangerous. This not only makes landowners more accessible to general people, and especially people passing through their lands, but also provides the landowners an opportunity to ask for things from their guests in return. The group of sellswords staying by royal decree in your nightly fortification may well be the exact people you want to send to deal with that rabid dog problem that you're having on the edge of your vineyards. And the pilgrims who arrive during the night on their way to a sacred relic many, many miles away may well be able to intercede on behalf of your soul, may well be able to spend their night praying for you and your household's success. This broadens the inn setting from those traditional Tudor-esque coaching inns that we're all imagining, really, creating a bit of different scenery, while also giving more opportunities for stories to intersect and bash into more complex fragmentations from the meeting of different social groups who otherwise might feel a bit contrived to be put together in the same place. Of course, if you can't find an inn, fort, or keep, imposing yourselves upon a local village may just be your best bet. As I said earlier, asking people of a similar social class or who have some tenuous connection to yourself for a room in their house for the night was not an incredibly uncommon practice in the medieval period. Might be a bit more dangerous considering all of the shape-changing threats that are out to get people, but it might still be a practice available to people in fantasy worlds. The main thing is, it depends on how respectable and down-to-earth and normal you seem to these other people. A pilgrim on their way to a holy site, especially if you worship a similar pantheon or have some religious connections yourself, is probably a sort of trustworthy person. But the group of people who are turning up with the head of a manticore on their saddlebag and a collection of armors and armaments probably feel a little unsafe to be put around you. Besides, adventurers kind of operate in their own sort of social class. They're not quite peasants or serfs, they're free men, that's for sure. They are generally sort of unwashed, dirty vagrants, but also have significant amounts of money, power, and resources. So they operate this strange middle ground, kind of outside of the realm of lords and ladies, and certainly outside of the realm of the regular serfs. The closest analogue probably, again, merchants and mercenaries. There are a few ways that adventurers could endear themselves. Being kind of folk heroes in the local area is a very good start. Second, if you share an affiliation or personal history, butchers are more likely to take in a butcher's son, for example, or if you share a god or divinity, that might be a connection point. And also, it's possible that generational connections might be useful in this case. The longer-lived races may have had an uncle pass through this land many, many years ago, 3 generations ago, who promised when he was back next from elven lands would grant the townsfolk some elven wine. If you're the descendant of this, and that's going to be memorable, the last elf who passed through here was your uncle, you might receive a similar level of hospitality and friendliness. But whatever the case, for telling a story, things happen when you meet different people, different strangers in different social strata. That's just the truth of the matter, and spending every single night in the same encampment with the same 4 to 5 individuals and a couple of ponies isn't the most conducive to developing bonds and connections across the world, to immersing our characters into a space that feels alive and vibrant. Yes, camping as in the wilderness gives a clear evocation of loneliness, isolation, and the threat of the wilderness around you, but an occasional stop-off in a monastery, a religious order, a hunter's lodge, maybe a fisherman's hut, can create those immediate and clear bonds to the place that oftentimes are necessary in these sorts of stories to ground the whole thing. I've been toying with systems in my D&D games that prioritize more safe resting places and penalize repeated attempts to muck it out in the wilderness. And I think this is the exact sort of world-building thing that we can introduce on top of a world that creates a social and roleplay and lore and kind of world-building basis for a mechanical shift. These fortified inns, the practice of arriving at a new village and needing to find somewhere to stay with someone who has a connection to you, as opposed to just the tavern, which isn't a tavern, it's an inn, and why is it even there, might be the exact sort of undergirding that makes a more social, interconnected world feel really present and alive. But with all that said, that is going to be the end of today's video. Please let me know what sort of tropes, topics, spells, and all sorts of things I should be trying to tackle in a world-building context next in the comments, and let me know if any of these ideas resonate or you're already using them potentially in your games. But with all that said, thank you so much for watching. I've been Tom, otherwise known as the Grungeon Master. Thank you again for watching, and I will see you in the next video.